The bright morning sun reflected off the pristine white walls of the Earth International Art Institute. Vale stood at its entrance, his iridescent skin shimmering with barely contained disdain. As the most celebrated artist from the Lemurian civilization, he found it almost insulting to be sent to this backward planet for a cultural exchange. His elongated fingers, each containing 3 extra joints that allowed for superior artistic precision, clutched a digital portfolio of his work. Inside were paintings that existed in 7 dimensions, sculptures that changed their molecular structure based on the viewer's emotions, and installations that bent both time and space. "Welcome to Earth, distinguished artist Vale," the Institute's director, Mr. Brown, said with a warm smile. He was a short, round man with kind eyes and gray hair. "We're honored to have you here." Vale's upper lip twitched slightly. The translator device attached to his neck converted his musical language into English. "The honor is noted," he said, his tone carrying a hint of condescension that the humans seemed to miss. The small welcoming committee led him through the Institute's main gallery. Vale's 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern on his face, scanned the artwork on display. Each piece seemed more primitive than the last. Flat canvases with oil paints, sculptures that just sat there, doing nothing. Photography that captured only what the eye could see. How utterly boring. The tour stopped at a painting that the humans seemed particularly proud of. It showed a sunset over an ocean, with birds flying across an orange sky. Mr. Brown gestured to it enthusiastically. "This is one of our most celebrated recent acquisitions. The artist spent 3 years perfecting the light and shadow work." Vale couldn't contain himself any longer. A sound like tinkling crystals emerged from his throat, his species' version of a laugh. The translator converted it into human laughter, making several people in the group shift uncomfortably. 3 years, Vale said, pulling up a holographic display from his portfolio. "Let me show you what 3 hours of work looks like on Lemuria." The air in front of them shimmered as a painting materialized. It showed not just an ocean scene, but every possible ocean scene that could exist, all layered into infinite dimensions. The waves moved in real time, each droplet containing an entire universe of detail. The light didn't just show a sunset. It showed the entire life cycle of a star, compressed into a single moment. "This," Vale said, gesturing to the human painting, "is like comparing cave drawings to this." He waved at his own work. "Your artists are still playing with colored mud on flat surfaces. It's, what's the word? Cute." The silence that followed was heavy. Mr. Brown's smile had become somewhat fixed, though he maintained his professional composure. Other members of the welcoming committee whispered among themselves. From the back of the group, a quiet voice spoke up. "Would you like to see more of our cave drawings before making your final judgment?" Vale turned all 4 eyes toward the speaker. A tall, thin man with paint-stained fingers stood there. His name tag read Tom, museum curator. Unlike the others, he didn't seem offended. Instead, he had an odd little smile on his face, as if he knew something Vale didn't. "I've seen enough," Vale said dismissively. "Your art is technically primitive, emotionally simplistic, and limited by your 3-dimensional understanding of the universe." "Then you won't mind proving it," Tom replied, still wearing that mysterious smile. "Visit our galleries, our museums, our streets. See our art where it lives, not just where we display it. If you still feel the same way afterward, I'll personally write a report confirming the superiority of Lemurian art." Vale considered the challenge. It would mean wasting time looking at more primitive artwork, but it would also give him material for his report back home about why Earth art was so far behind galactic standards. "Very well," he said finally. "Show me these masterpieces of yours. Though I doubt they'll change my mind." Tom nodded, that knowing smile never leaving his face. "We'll start tomorrow. I hope you're ready for a surprise, distinguished artist Vale." As the group dispersed, Vale looked back at the sunset painting. Such a simple thing, really. Yet something about the curator's confidence bothered him. What could these humans possibly show him that he hadn't seen before? He would soon find out. The next morning dawned cold and foggy in the city. Vale stood outside his temporary living quarters, watching human vehicles crawl through the mist like strange insects. His first destination with Tom was something called the Modern Art Museum. "You look troubled," Tom said, appearing beside him. The curator wore the same paint-stained jacket as yesterday, though Vale noticed different colors today. "Fresh stains." "Not troubled," Vale replied. "Just wondering why I agreed to waste my time." Tom pulled out an old paper map instead of using digital navigation. Vale's upper right eye twitched at this deliberate primitiveness. "Sometimes the old ways have their own charm," Tom said, noticing Vale's reaction. "Like taking the longer path to truly see something." They walked through the city streets, and Vale couldn't help but notice the art that humans had scattered everywhere. Murals on walls, sculptures in parks, even the way they decorated their shop windows. It was all so messy, unplanned, random. The Modern Art Museum was a stark building of glass and steel. Inside, Tom led Vale to their first stop, a large canvas covered entirely in white paint. Really, Vale's translator couldn't quite capture the full extent of his derision. "A white square. This is what you wanted to show me." Tom stepped closer to the painting. "Look at the texture, the layers. The artist spent months building up these subtle variations in white. It's about seeing beyond the obvious." Vale moved closer, his 4 eyes adjusting to study the surface. He had to admit, there were patterns in the whiteness, ridges and valleys of paint that caught the light in unexpected ways. Still, compared to his people's art. "On my world," Vale said, "we have paintings that react to brain patterns, that change color based on the viewer's thoughts. This is just paint. Yet you stepped closer to see it better," Tom observed quietly. "Your art forces an experience. Ours invites exploration." They moved through the gallery. Tom showed him works that challenged Vale's understanding of what art could be. Pieces made from trash, installations that used silence as their medium, videos that showed the same moment from multiple perspectives. Vale found himself growing frustrated. Not because the art was primitive, though technically it was, but because he couldn't dismiss it as easily as he wanted to. There was something here he couldn't quite grasp. "Tell me," Tom said as they stood before a sculpture made of twisted metal, "on your world, how long does it take to become an artist?" "We begin training at birth," Vale answered proudly. "Our extra joints are genetically engineered for artistic precision. Our eyes are modified to see more colors, more dimensions. By the time we're adults, we've mastered every artistic technique known to our species." Tom nodded, touching one of the paint stains on his jacket. "And how many of your artists fail?" "Fail." Vale blinked, all 4 eyes in sequence. "None fail. We're designed for success." "That's what I thought." Tom turned to face him fully. "Here, most artists fail. Many times. Some never succeed by traditional measures. But they keep creating anyway. Why do you think that is?" Vale had no answer. The concept of artistic failure didn't exist in his world. Everything was calculated, measured, perfected before it was even attempted. As they left the museum, Vale noticed a small group of human children sitting on the steps outside. They were drawing with colored chalk on the concrete, laughing as they made impossible creatures and rainbow-colored skies. "What are they doing wrong?" Vale asked, genuinely puzzled. "Their colors don't match reality. The proportions are incorrect. None of them are following any artistic principles." Tom smiled that knowing smile again. "Who said they're doing anything wrong?" Vale watched the children draw, feeling something uncomfortable settle in his perfectly engineered mind. He had come to Earth expecting to confirm his species' superiority in art. Instead, he found himself questioning everything he had been taught about what art was supposed to be. "Tomorrow," Tom said, "we visit something older. Much older. Are you ready to see what humans can do when we have thousands of years to practice? Vale nodded slowly, his certainty beginning to crack like old paint. The Sistine Chapel stood before them in the early morning light. Vale had to crane his neck back to take in the full height of the building, all four eyes widening slightly. This structure is old, he said, trying to maintain his usual tone of superiority, but not quite managing it. Over 500 years, Tom replied, leading him toward the entrance. Built by human hands, painted by human hands. He emphasized the word hands each time, a subtle reminder of Vale's earlier boasts about his species' engineered perfection. Inside, Vale stopped dead in his tracks. His iridescent skin flickered through several colors before settling on a pale blue, a sign of surprise in his species. Above him, stretching across the vast ceiling, was Michelangelo's masterpiece. How? He paused, his translator clicking as it struggled to convert his emotional response into words. How long did this take? 4 years, Tom said quietly, on his back, on scaffolding with paint dripping in his eyes. No genetic engineering, no extra joints, just determination and vision. Vale's eyes moved from scene to scene, taking in the complex compositions, the interplay of light and shadow, the hundreds of figures that seemed to move and breathe on the ceiling above. His species could create art in 7 dimensions, yet something about these simple pigments on plaster made his heart beat faster. The architecture, he said finally, grasping for his usual dismissive attitude. It's the architecture enhancing the effect. The way the light falls through the windows, the height of the ceiling. These are mathematical principles at work. Tom just nodded. Then let's look closer. They spent hours examining the details. Vale found himself drawn to the faces. So many faces, each one different, each telling its own story. In his world, art was perfect, precise, mathematically balanced. But these faces, they were imperfect. Some were twisted in agony, others lifted in ecstasy. The muscles and bones beneath the skin seemed to pulse with life. There, Tom said, pointing to a particular figure. Look at the hand reaching out to Adam. See how the gap between the fingers creates tension, how it makes you want to reach out yourself. Vale stared at the space between those painted fingers. On his world, such a gap would be considered a flaw. Empty space served no purpose. Art should be complete, whole, perfect. But this gap, this imperfection, it made him feel something. I don't understand, Vale admitted, his voice barely a whisper. We can create art that exists in multiple dimensions. We can make colors that change based on emotions. We can build sculptures that rearrange their atomic structure. But I've never felt like this looking at any of it. Tom sat down on one of the benches, patting the space beside him. Vale sank down, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Your art shows perfection, Tom said. Ours shows struggle. Your art displays mastery. Ours shows reaching, always reaching for something just beyond our grasp. He pointed up at the gap between God's and Adam's fingers again. Like that eternal moment of almost touching. The perfection isn't in the achievement, it's in the attempt. A small group of human tourists entered the chapel, their voices dropping to hushed whispers as they looked up. Vale watched their faces, saw the same awe he was feeling reflected in their expressions. We would have filled that gap, Vale said, more to himself than to Tom. We would have made those fingers touch. We would have made it perfect. And in doing so, Tom replied gently, you might have missed the point entirely. Vale felt something wet on his face. Reaching up, he touched his cheek, surprised to find moisture there. He had never cried before. His species had engineered that response out of their biology centuries ago. Yet here he was, crying over pigments on plaster created by primitive humans hundreds of years ago. Where are we going tomorrow? He asked, his voice unsteady. Tomorrow. Tom smiled. Tomorrow we go even further back. Are you ready to see what humans painted when we lived in caves? Vale looked up one more time at the ceiling, at all those imperfect, powerful, achingly beautiful figures. I'm not sure I'm ready for anything anymore. The cave entrance looked like nothing special to Vale. Just a dark hole in a cliff face, surrounded by ancient rock. After yesterday's experience at the Sistine Chapel, he had expected something more impressive. 30,000 years, Tom said, turning on his flashlight. That's how old the art is down here. Vale's skin rippled with disbelief. Impossible. No art could survive that long. Follow me, Tom said, leading the way into the darkness. Their footsteps echoed as they walked deeper into the cave. Vale's enhanced eyes adjusted quickly to the dim light, but he found himself staying close to Tom anyway. Something about this place felt heavy with time. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Tom's flashlight beam swept across the walls. Vale stopped breathing for a moment. Animals. Dozens of them. Painted in red and black ochre, they seemed to dance across the rock face. Horses galloped through ancient darkness. Bison charged with lowered heads. Lions stalked their prey through shadows that had lasted millennia. These were your ancestors? Vale asked, his voice hushed. The ones you call prehistoric humans. Yes. Tom walked closer to one wall, his light revealing more details. They painted with their hands, using crushed minerals and animal fat. They climbed rickety wooden scaffolds to reach the higher areas. Some artists even put paint in their mouths and sprayed it over their hands to leave these. He shined the light on a series of handprints pressed against the stone. Vale moved closer, all four eyes focusing intensely. He could see every detail. The imperfect lines, the smudges, the places where the paint had run. On his world, such flaws would have been erased, corrected, perfected. But here, they're alive, he whispered. What do you mean? Tom asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. The animals. They're moving. Not like our motion art that actually moves, but Vale struggled to find the words. The way they're drawn. The curves, the lines. They capture the motion inside themselves. They're frozen but flowing. Imperfect but true. He reached out, his many-jointed fingers hovering just above a painted horse. Its muscles seemed to bunch and stretch beneath its painted skin. Its eyes, those simple black dots, somehow held more life than any seven-dimensional artwork he'd ever created. Your people, Vale said slowly, they had no training, no special genes, no technology. They had nothing but their hands and minds. And their hearts, Tom added quietly. Don't forget their hearts. Vale nodded, understanding finally dawning. That's what we lost, he said. In pursuing perfection, in engineering our bodies and minds for technical excellence, we lost this. He gestured at the cave walls. This rawness. This humanity. They stood in silence for a while, watching the prehistoric animals race across the stone walls. Vale found himself counting heartbeats. He had 2 hearts, but for the first time, he felt like it wasn't enough to contain what he was feeling. You know what's remarkable? Tom said eventually. These artists never signed their work, never claimed it. They just created it and left it here in the darkness. No fame, no recognition, just pure expression. Vale thought about his own gallery back home, filled with mathematically perfect works, each one prominently bearing his name, each one designed to showcase his technical mastery, each one, he now realized, completely empty of the raw power he felt in this cave. There's more to see, Tom said, starting to move toward another tunnel. Ready to go deeper. Vale took one last look at the ancient artwork. On my world, he said, we believe we've reached the peak of artistic achievement. But standing here, I feel like we haven't even begun to climb. As they walked deeper into the cave, Vale's skin glowed faintly, providing extra light. But for once, he wasn't trying to be helpful or superior. He just wanted to see more, to understand more, to feel more of what these ancient humans had left behind in the darkness. His certainty about art, about his own superiority, about everything he thought he knew, was crumbling like ancient cave walls. And somehow, that felt exactly right. The small art gallery was nothing special from the outside. Just a converted old house with a hand-painted sign reading Community Art Space hanging over the door. After seeing the grandeur of the Sistine Chapel and the ancient power of cave paintings, Vale couldn't understand why Tom had brought him here. "This is our last stop for today," Tom said, pushing open the creaky door. Inside, the walls were covered with artwork of all kinds. But these weren't masterpieces by famous artists or historical treasures. They were paintings by children, sketches by elderly people just learning to draw, and works by local artists still finding their style. Vale was about to make a dismissive comment when he heard it, the sound of children laughing. Tom led him to a room at the back of the gallery where an art class was in progress. About 10 children sat at tables, paint and paper spread out before them. "Today we're painting our families," the teacher announced cheerfully. "Remember, there's no wrong way to do it. Just paint them the way you see them in your heart." Vale watched as the children began to work. Their techniques were terrible. Paint splashed everywhere, proportions all wrong, colors mixed into muddy browns. One little girl was painting her father 3 times taller than her mother. A boy was drawing his baby sister in bright purple. He was about to turn away when he noticed one child in particular. A small girl with untidy hair was painting with intense concentration. Her family portrait was technically awful, stick figures with enormous heads and tiny bodies, standing in what looked like green rain under an orange sky. But something made Vale move closer. The girl looked up at him, not at all frightened by his alien appearance. "This is my family," she said proudly. "That's my mom. She gives the best hugs, so I made her arms extra long. And that's my dad. He tells the best stories, so I made his head big for all the stories inside. And that's my dog. He's blue because that's his favorite color." Vale stared at the painting. It broke every rule of art he had ever learned. The perspective was impossible, the anatomy was absurd, and dogs certainly couldn't have favorite colors. Yet, he felt his eyes growing wet again. Because in those crude stick figures, in those impossible proportions, in that orange sky and green rain, he saw something he had never achieved in all his perfectly engineered artwork. He saw love. The girl had painted her family not as they looked, but as she felt them. The long-armed mother wrapped in perpetual hugs. The father with a head full of stories. The blue dog that existed only in a child's understanding of the world. Vale's hands began to tremble. All his extra joints, his enhanced eyes, his genetic modifications, none of them had ever allowed him to create something this pure, this true. "Are you okay?" the girl asked, noticing his tears. "Don't be sad. You can paint with us if you want." Tom quietly placed a blank piece of paper in front of Vale, along with some brushes and paint. Vale sat down at the small table, his long frame awkward in the tiny chair. I don't know how," he admitted. "Not like this. Not without my tools and enhancements." The girl pushed a brush toward him. "It's easy. You just think about what makes you happy and put it on the paper." Vale picked up the brush. It felt strange in his many-jointed fingers. Primitive. Limited. Perfect. As he began to paint, making clumsy strokes with unfamiliar tools, he realized that he was crying freely now. But they weren't tears of frustration or sadness. They were tears of release. Because here, in this small gallery, watching children paint impossible scenes with untrained hands and pure hearts, Vale finally understood what art really was. It wasn't about technical perfection. It wasn't about dimensional complexity. It wasn't about genetic engineering or enhanced perception. It was about truth, about love, about seeing the world not as it was, but as it felt. And in that moment, Vale realized that humans hadn't just mastered art. They had mastered something far more important. They had mastered being alive. Evening sunlight streamed through the windows of the empty gallery. The children had gone home, leaving behind the scent of paint and the echo of laughter. Vale sat on the floor, surrounded by his attempts at painting, each one technically horrible, each one filled with something he'd never achieved before, genuine feeling. Tom sat across from him, quietly watching as Vale touched each painting with trembling fingers. "I need to tell you something," Vale said finally. His translator clicked softly, struggling to convert the complex emotions in his voice. "About my world. About our art." "I'm listening," Tom replied. Vale picked up one of his crude attempts, a painting of his home world's 3 moons. The proportions were wrong, the colors inexact, but somehow it captured the longing he felt when he thought of home. "We weren't always like this," he began. "We weren't always engineered for perfection. There was a time, thousands of years ago, when we made art like humans do, with simple tools, with imperfect hands." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But then we discovered how to modify ourselves." Tom leaned forward, interested. Vale continued, his skin shifting to deeper shades of blue, a sign of deep emotion in his species. "First, it was small changes. Extra joints in our fingers for better control, enhanced eyes to see more colors. But it didn't stop there. Each generation added more modifications, more perfection, more control." Vale stood up and walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that no engineering could improve. "We thought we were advancing art to its highest form. 7-dimensional paintings, sculptures that respond to thoughts, colors that exist in multiple realities at once." His voice grew quieter. "But with each advancement, we lost something. Something we didn't even know we were losing until—" "Until what?" Tom asked softly. "Until I saw that child's painting today." Vale turned back to face Tom. "Do you know what art is like on my world now? We don't have children making messy paintings of their families. We don't have beginners learning through mistakes. We don't have elderly people discovering art late in life." He picked up another of his attempts, a portrait of Tom that looked nothing like him, but somehow captured his quiet wisdom. "On my world, art is perfect. Technical. Flawless." Vale's voice cracked. "And completely empty." Tom stood and walked over to one of Vale's paintings, studying it carefully. "These are your first imperfect works since childhood, aren't they?" Vale nodded. "We start genetic modification at birth. I haven't made a mistake in my art for over 200 years. He laughed softly. "Until today. And these mistakes, they feel more real than anything I've ever created." "They are real," Tom said, "because they're truly yours. Not your engineering's, not your modifications. Yours." Vale looked down at his many-jointed fingers, the physical proof of his species' pursuit of perfection. "We thought we were evolving, advancing, but now I realize we were doing the opposite. We were so focused on making art perfect that we forgot to make it true." He gathered his paintings, clumsy, honest works that would be considered trash on his world. "My people need to see these. They need to understand what we've lost, what we need to find again." Tom smiled. "And how will you convince them? These would be considered primitive by your world standards." Vale's skin shifted to a determined gold color. "I'll show them what I learned here. That perfection isn't about control. It's about letting go. That art isn't about showcasing skill. It's about sharing your heart." He looked at his paintings one last time. "We engineered ourselves to be perfect artists, but humans reminded me how to be a real one." The setting sun painted the room in warm colors, and Vale realized something else. For the first time in his long life, he didn't want to enhance or modify or perfect what he was seeing. Sometimes, he now understood, imperfection was the greatest perfection of all. On his last day on Earth, Vale stood before the Earth International Art Institute again. But this time, he wasn't standing outside as a superior being looking down on primitive art. He was inside, setting up an exhibition of his own. His hand shook slightly as he hung his paintings, not his old, technically perfect works, but the new ones he had created over the past week. Messy, imperfect, Emotional pieces done with regular paint and brush, each one a testament to what he had learned. "Are you sure about this?" Tom asked, helping him arrange the display. "These aren't what your people would expect." Vale nodded, his skin glowing with a mix of nervousness and determination. "That's exactly why they need to see them." The gallery began to fill with people, human artists, alien diplomats, and in the front row, the children from the community art class. The little girl who had first shown him how to paint with his heart sat there, beaming up at him. Vale stepped up to the podium, his translator clicking as he prepared to speak. The room fell silent. "A week ago, I came to Earth believing I would find primitive art," he began. "Art that was technically inferior, simplistic, limited. I came to confirm what my people have believed for generations, that our engineered perfection had made us the greatest artists in the galaxy." He gestured to his old work, a 7-dimensional piece that hung in one corner, technically flawless and emotionally empty. "This is what I used to create, perfect in every way, and completely lifeless." Then he turned to his new paintings, crude landscapes, simple portraits, abstract expressions of emotion. "And these are what I create now, with unmodified hands, with regular paint, with my heart instead of my engineering." The audience murmured as they looked at both sets of works. Vale continued, his voice growing stronger. "My people forgot something vital in our pursuit of perfection. We forgot that art isn't about showing what we can do. It's about showing who we are. It's not about technical mastery. It's about truth." He picked up a brush, dipped it in paint, and walked to a blank canvas set up on an easel. "Watch," he said, and began to paint. His many-jointed fingers, designed for precision, now moved with deliberate roughness. He let the paint drip, let the lines waver, let the colors mix in unplanned ways. As he painted, he felt tears running down his face again, but he didn't try to hide them. When he finished, there stood a portrait of Earth, not as it looked from space, but as it felt to him now. A world of messy, beautiful imperfection, of children's laughter and cave paintings, of sunset colors that needed no enhancement. "I'm establishing an exchange program," he announced, "not to teach humans our techniques, as originally planned, but to bring human artists to my world, to teach us what we've forgotten, to help us remember how to create with our hearts again." The little girl from the art class raised her hand. "Can I come teach on your planet?" Vale smiled, his skin glowing with warm colors. "In a few years, yes. We have much to learn from artists like you." As the crowd moved through the gallery, Vale stood with Tom near the exit. "Do you think your people will understand?" Tom asked. Vale watched as an alien diplomat stood before one of his crude paintings, tears rolling down their face. "Some will, some won't, but it's a start." He looked down at his hands, at all their engineered perfection. "We spent centuries learning how to make art. Now it's time to learn how to feel it again." Outside, the sun was setting on his last day on Earth. Vale had arrived as the galaxy's most technically accomplished artist. He was leaving as something far more important, a beginner, someone ready to learn, to feel, to make mistakes, to grow. Someone ready, at last, to create real art. And somewhere in the gallery behind him, a child was teaching an alien diplomat how to paint with their heart instead of their hands. The transformation had begun.